Mary Williams shifted nervously in seat 14B, her fingers gripping the boarding pass so tightly it was starting to crumple. The British Airways flight from Manchester to Birmingham was filling up fast, and she watched people stream past her, some muttering about delays while others chatted cheerfully about weekend visits. She had just spent 2 days with her sister Jessica in Manchester, and all she wanted was to get home, have a cup of tea, and unwind. As more passengers found their seats, Mary's attention was caught by 2 flight attendants talking quietly near the galley. Their hushed tones made her lean forward slightly, though she tried not to stare. The older attendant, a woman with greying hair pulled back in a neat bun, shook her head as she spoke. "Did you see Captain Thompson in the crew room earlier? He didn't look well at all," she said. The younger male attendant nodded. "I know. He mentioned he's been having a tough time lately. His divorce just went through and he's barely sleeping, but he said he'll be all right once we're airborne. You know how it is. Once he's in the cockpit, he's all business." Mary felt her stomach lurch, though the plane hadn't even begun to move yet. Those words echoed in her mind, and she remembered her father's firm voice from years ago. Her dad had been a pilot for 30 years before he passed away when she was 16. He drummed into her head that pilots needed to be in perfect condition. Before every flight, sharp minds, steady hands, and clear heads. "A pilot carries hundreds of lives in his hands, Mary," he would say. "There's no room for anything less than your absolute best." The flight attendants moved away to help passengers with their luggage, but their conversation had unsettled Mary deeply. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself she was being paranoid, but then she saw him. Captain Thompson emerged from the cockpit and walked down the aisle, presumably heading to the lavatory or the crew area. Even from her middle seat, Mary could see something was off. He moved with slight unsteadiness, his shoulder bumping against one seat back as he passed. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and there was a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead. Mary's heart began to race. This wasn't just tiredness from a rough week. Something was seriously wrong. Her mind flashed back to her Uncle Tom, who had struggled with drinking after his wife left him. She'd seen that same pallor, that same unsteady gait at family gatherings. She glanced at the passengers around her. James, a businessman in the aisle seat, was already absorbed in his laptop, tapping away at some report. Emma and David, the young couple across the aisle, were taking selfies with their phones. Mrs. Davies, an elderly woman behind her, was knitting peacefully. No one else seemed to have noticed the captain's condition. The plane began to taxi slowly toward the runway. Mary's palms were sweating now. She had to do something. Raising her hand tentatively, she tried to catch the eye of Patricia, the flight attendant who was moving down the aisle checking seatbelts. "Excuse me," Mary called softly. Patricia turned with a professional smile. "Yes, miss? Do you need something?" Mary lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "I hate to say this, but I think there might be something wrong with the pilot. I noticed he seemed unwell when he walked past." Patricia's smile widened, becoming even more reassuring. "Oh, don't you worry about that, miss. Captain Thompson might be having a rough patch personally, but he's one of our most experienced pilots. He's been flying for 20 years and he knows these planes inside and out. You're in excellent hands." Mary felt her face flush with embarrassment. My father was a pilot and he always said, "I appreciate your concern," Patricia interrupted gently but firmly. "But I assure you, everything is perfectly fine. Captain Thompson would never fly if he wasn't fit for duty. Now, please make sure your seatbelt is fastened. We'll be taking off shortly." With that, Patricia moved on to the next row, leaving Mary feeling foolish and uncertain. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was letting her past experiences cloud her judgment. Yet, deep down, that nagging worry wouldn't go away. Mary slumped back in her seat, the vinyl creaking beneath her. The weight of what she might have witnessed pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. James glanced over from his laptop, noticing her distress. "Everything all right?" he asked casually. I'm not sure," Mary mumbled, not wanting to raise an alarm but unable to completely dismiss her concerns. James shrugged and returned to his work. "First time flying?" "No, it's not that," Mary said, but he had already tuned her out. The engines grew louder as the plane turned onto the runway. Mary's mind raced faster than the aircraft accelerating beneath her. What if she was wrong? What if she was right? Either way, she felt powerless, trapped in her seat as the plane began to lift off the ground. 10 minutes into the flight, Mary Williams felt her anxiety transform into genuine fear. The aircraft began to wobble more erratically than she had ever experienced before, and each shake seemed to confirm her worst suspicions. Other passengers stirred slightly, some glancing out windows, but most returned to their books, tablets, or quiet conversations as if nothing was amiss. Then came the announcement that made Mary's blood run cold. The intercom crackled to life, and Captain Thompson's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're, expecting some mild turbulence ahead. Please keep those seatbelts, fastened." The words slurred together slightly at the edges, and Mary heard the uncertainty in his speech patterns. Her father had taught her to listen carefully to pilot announcements. A clear mind and steady voice were crucial for passenger confidence. This was neither clear nor steady. Mary turned quickly to James Peterson, the businessman sitting in the aisle seat beside her. His expensive suit and leather briefcase suggested someone who flew frequently. Perhaps he would understand her concerns better. "Did you notice anything odd about that announcement?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing. "Heart." James barely lifted his eyes from his laptop screen, where he was typing furiously on some report. "I'm sure it's nothing," he replied dismissively, not even bothering to look at her properly. "These pilots make hundreds of flights. Let the professionals do their job." His words stung, but Mary forced herself not to take it personally. She scanned the cabin again, hoping to find anyone who might share her concerns. Perhaps if she wasn't alone in her observations, the crew would take her more seriously. Mrs. Betty Davies, a grandmother traveling to see her new grandchild, sat behind Mary, her knitting needles clicking steadily. She seemed entirely absorbed in creating what looked like a yellow baby blanket, her face peaceful and content. Across the aisle, Peter and Lucy Green, a young married couple, had their heads bent together over travel magazines. They were whispering excitedly about their upcoming holiday to Spain, occasionally showing each other pictures of beaches and restaurants they wanted to visit. Further back, young Thomas Miller, about 12 years old, was engrossed in his handheld gaming device, his thumbs moving rapidly across the buttons. His parents were dozing, trusting that their son was entertained and the flight was routine. Everyone seemed so calm, so normal, so unaware. Mary felt isolated in her fear, like she was the only person who could see the approaching danger, while everyone else remained blissfully ignorant. Her hands began to tremble as she remembered her father's words from years ago. They had been sitting in their garden when she was 15, and she'd been upset about standing up to a bully at school. "Mary, sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone," he had said, placing his weathered pilot's hand over hers. "But other people's lives may depend on your courage. Never be afraid to speak up when something isn't right." The plane wobbled again, this time more pronounced than before. A few passengers looked up briefly. Emma Clark clutched her book tighter. Robert Wilson steadied his coffee cup. But then they all went back to what they were doing. Even the mild reaction seemed to convince them it was just ordinary turbulence. Mary took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Her finger hovered over the call button. She had already tried once, and Patricia had dismissed her concerns. Would trying again just make her look hysterical? Would they think she was some nervous passenger who couldn't handle a normal flight? But this wasn't normal. The evidence was mounting. The stumbling she'd witnessed, the concerning whispers between crew members, and now the slurred announcement. Every instinct her father had taught her was screaming that something was wrong. Finally, Mary pressed the call button again, this time with more determination. The soft ding echoed in the cabin, and she saw Patricia approaching from the front of the aircraft. This time Mary wouldn't let herself be brushed off so easily. As Patricia walked down the aisle, Mary noticed her smile was a bit strained. A few passengers glanced curiously at Mary, the woman who was calling for assistance twice in such a short time. James sighed audibly and shifted in his seat, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "How can I help you now, miss?" Patricia asked, her patience wearing thin. Mary opened her mouth to speak, But suddenly the plane hit another rough patch. This time several passengers gasped, and a few loose items rattled in the overhead compartments. The turbulence seemed to validate Mary's concerns, at least for a moment. Looking around the cabin one more time at all the unsuspecting faces, the sleeping parents, the cheerful couple, the grandmother knitting for her grandchild, Mary felt the full weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. These weren't just strangers anymore. They were lives that might depend on her willingness to keep speaking up, no matter how alone or foolish she might feel. When Patricia arrived at Mary's row again, Mary knew she had to be direct. This wasn't the time for polite suggestions or vague concerns. She looked Patricia straight in the eye and spoke with all the urgency she felt. "Please, I need to speak to someone in charge immediately." "I believe the pilot has been drinking," Mary said, her voice clear and firm despite her racing heart. Patricia's professional smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of shock and concern. The pleasant mask she'd worn moments earlier completely disappeared, and Mary could see the woman processing what she'd just heard. "That's a very serious accusation, miss," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Do you understand what you're saying?" "Yes, I do," Mary responded without hesitation. "I saw him stumbling when he walked past earlier. His face was pale and sweaty. I heard crew members saying he was having personal problems, and then that announcement, his speech was slurred. These aren't normal signs. I'm not trying to cause trouble," Mary continued, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I'm trying to prevent a disaster. I'm trying to save everyone on this plane." The cabin had fallen noticeably quieter. Passengers in nearby rows had stopped their activities to listen to the conversation. The tension spread like ripples in water, reaching further back as people craned their necks to see what was happening. Robert Taylor, a dignified man in his 70s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward from his seat 2 rows behind. As a retired teacher who had spent 40 years dealing with young people's concerns, he had learned when to take someone seriously. "Let her speak," he said firmly, his educated voice carrying weight. "We should at least check. If she's wrong, it's a simple misunderstanding. If she's right, well, we need to know." But his support was immediately countered by Daniel Wilson, a man in his 40s sitting directly across the aisle from Mary. Daniel was dressed in a wrinkled business suit, clearly tired from a long weekend. He rolled his eyes dramatically and shook his head. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Daniel groaned loudly. "Great, now we have paranoia spreading through the cabin. What's next? Are we going to suspect every crew member of something?" His dismissive comment made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sophie Mitchell, a nurse from Bristol, bit her lip, torn between her natural empathy and her desire to avoid confrontation. George Hughes, a construction worker heading home after a week of work in Manchester, crossed his arms defensively. Mary felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. The attention of dozens of strangers bore down on her, and she could practically feel their judgment. Was she overreacting, making a fool of herself? But then she closed her eyes for just a moment and thought of Emma, her 5-year-old niece. Emma had big brown eyes, just like Mary's, and she loved hearing stories about Auntie Mary's flights. The little girl would be waiting at home right now, probably pestering Mary's sister Jessica about when Auntie Mary would call to say she'd landed safely. Opening her eyes, Mary found her resolve steeled by the thought of Emma and all the other loved ones waiting for the passengers on this flight. She slowly stood up, gripping the seat in front of her for balance as the plane continued to rock slightly. "I'm going to keep speaking up until someone listens," Mary declared loudly, her voice carrying through the cabin, "because I'd rather be embarrassed and alive than quiet and dead." Patricia looked flustered, clearly unprepared for such a bold stance. Other crew members had noticed the commotion and were approaching. Michael Johnson, a senior flight attendant, hurried down the aisle. "What's the situation here?" Michael asked, his tone professional but concerned. Before Patricia could respond, Mary addressed him directly. "I believe Captain Thompson is unfit to fly this aircraft, and I need you to investigate immediately." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Some passengers gasped quietly. Mrs. Davies put down her knitting, her hands suddenly still. The green couple looked at each other with wide eyes. Young Thomas Miller had paused his game and was now listening intently, his face pale with sudden understanding that something serious was happening. His parents had woken up and were holding hands tightly. The plane hit another patch of minor turbulence, causing drinks to slosh in cups and magazines to slide from lap tables. This time, however, no one dismissed it as routine. In the context of Mary's accusation, every bump felt ominous. "Miss, you do realize the gravity of what you're suggesting?" Michael asked gently but firmly. "Yes," Mary replied steadily, "and you should realize the gravity of ignoring it." The confrontation had created a divide in the cabin. Some passengers, like Robert Taylor and Sophie Mitchell, seemed supportive or at least open to listening. Others, like Daniel Wilson and James Peterson, appeared annoyed or skeptical. Most, however, simply looked scared and confused. Mary remained standing, despite the irregular movements of the aircraft, her determination unwavering, even as doubt whispered in her ear. The atmosphere in the cabin had become increasingly tense as Mary continued to stand her ground. Other passengers shifted nervously in their seats, some beginning to wonder if maybe this woman was right to be concerned. The constant wobbling of the aircraft wasn't helping anyone feel secure, and Mary's determined stance had planted seeds of doubt in many minds. Then everything changed in an instant. The plane suddenly lurched dramatically to the left, dropping, sharply enough to lift people slightly from their seats. The force was so unexpected that drinks spilled across tray tables, magazines flew from laps, and several passengers let out involuntary screams. People grabbed their armrests with white-knuckled grips, hearts pounding as they looked around frantically for reassurance. Mary saw her opportunity in that terrifying moment. The fear on everyone's faces was exactly what she'd been trying to prevent from becoming something much worse. "Please," Mary shouted, her voice carrying through the cabin with urgency. "Someone has to check on the pilot. This isn't normal." Her words seemed to echo the thoughts of many passengers who were now genuinely worried. The dramatic movement had been unlike anything most of them had experienced in regular air travel. Even Daniel Wilson, who had been so dismissive earlier, looked visibly shaken and no longer quite so confident in his opposition. Flight attendant Michael Johnson, who had been observing the situation quietly while trying to maintain order, seemed to realize the gravity of the moment. His professional training told him to trust the pilot, but the evidence before his eyes, Mary's persistence, the unusual flight behavior, and now this dangerous maneuver, couldn't be ignored. "I'll go check," Michael finally said, his voice tight with tension. He moved purposefully down the aisle toward the cockpit, leaving Patricia to try to calm the increasingly nervous passengers. The next few minutes felt like hours. Children who had been happily playing were now clutching their parents' arms. The knitting needles in Mrs. Davies' hands lay forgotten in her lap. Even the most frequent flyers among them looked concerned, their usual travel confidence shaken by the combination of Mary's warnings and the plane's erratic behavior. When Michael returned from the cockpit, his face had drained of all color. His usually composed demeanor was replaced by something that made every passenger's stomach sink. He looked genuinely frightened. "We need to land immediately," Michael announced, his voice barely steady. "The co-pilot is taking control." The simple statement confirmed everyone's worst fears. The cabin erupted into a mixture of murmurs, gasps, and worried whispers. People turned to their travel companions, searching for comfort in shared shock. The reality of what Mary had been warning about hit everyone at once. "Thank God," someone whispered. "I can't believe it," another voice said, but it was Mrs. Davies, the grandmother with her knitting, who reached across the aisle to grasp Mary's hand. Her weathered fingers, strong from years of handicrafts, squeezed reassuringly. "Thank you for not giving up," Mrs. Davies said softly, her voice full of genuine gratitude. "You might have saved us all." As the plane began what everyone now understood was an emergency descent, Mary felt a complex mix of emotions. There was relief in being proven right, but absolutely no joy in it. She felt vindicated that her concerns had been valid, but there was no victory in the fear she saw on every face around her. Looking around the cabin, Mary truly understood the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about being right or wrong anymore. This was about 187 human lives, each with families, dreams, and people waiting for them at home. Her eyes moved from face to face, the young couple who had been so excited about their Spanish holiday, the business travelers with important meetings, the elderly passengers visiting loved ones, and the children who had no idea how close they had come to disaster. A baby started crying, probably sensing the tension in the air. A teenager comforted his worried elderly seatmate. Complete strangers offered words of encouragement to each, other creating temporary bonds forged by shared fear and relief. The descent felt different from normal landings. The plane moved with urgent purpose, and occasional communications from the cockpit, now in the co-pilot's steady voice, reassured everyone that they were heading to the nearest airport. Emergency vehicles were being prepared, but passengers were assured this was standard procedure. When the wheels finally touched the runway with a harder impact than usual, the cabin remained silent for just a heartbeat. Then, as if released from a spell, everyone burst into spontaneous applause. Relief flooded through the aircraft like a wave, some passengers wiping away tears they hadn't realized they'd been holding back. Mary sank back into her seat, her legs suddenly weak from the sustained tension. Around her, people began to relax, some laughing with relief, others still pale and quiet. The reality of what had just happened would take time to fully sink in. The moment the plane came to a complete stop on the tarmac, Mary peered out her window with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Red and blue lights flashed as emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars, all positioned and ready for any eventuality. The passengers around her began to relax more fully, realizing they were truly safe on the ground. Through her window, Mary watched as two uniformed airport security officers boarded the plane. They moved with purpose down the aisle, heading straight for the cockpit. Within minutes, Captain Thompson emerged between them, his appearance shocking even from a distance. His face was flushed red, his white uniform shirt untucked at one side, and his eyes had that unmistakable glazed, unfocused look that Mary had feared. As he was escorted past her row, Mary could smell the alcohol, sharp and unmistakable even in the recycled cabin air. Several passengers near her gasped quietly, the final proof of what had almost happened settling over them like a cold wave. Captain Thompson stumbled slightly as he walked, the officers having to steady him by his elbows. "Did you see that?" whispered Sophie Mitchell, the nurse who earlier had been unsure about supporting Mary. "He can barely walk straight." The gravity of the situation hit everyone anew. This was no longer about accusations or doubts. This was reality, happening in front of their eyes. Once inside the terminal, as passengers were being helped through the aftermath of the emergency landing, Patricia approached Mary. The flight attendant's professional facade had completely crumbled, replaced by genuine remorse and gratitude. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said, her voice shaking slightly. "I should have taken you seriously from the beginning. You were right all along." "It's okay," Mary replied softly. "I know you were just doing your job. Sometimes it's hard to believe something so serious could happen." "No," Patricia insisted, shaking her head firmly. "You tried to warn us. You fought when nobody would listen. We could have lost everyone today." As passengers made their way through the terminal, many sought out Mary personally. The businessman, James Peterson, was among the first. He approached her with visible embarrassment, his earlier confidence completely deflated. "Mary," he said, extending his hand, "I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. I was so focused on my own concerns that I dismissed yours. You probably saved my life today." "You couldn't have known," Mary replied, shaking his hand. "We're all just trying to get through our day, aren't we?" One by one, others came forward. Daniel Wilson, who had been so openly dismissive in the air, now looked sheepish. "I was wrong to doubt you. I'd rather be proven wrong 100 times than to be right about ignoring danger even once." But it was little Thomas Miller who touched Mary's heart the most. The 12-year-old approached her and threw his arms around her legs in a spontaneous hug that nearly knocked her off balance. "Thank you for keeping us safe," he said, his voice muffled against her jacket. Mary felt her eyes well up with tears. She bent down to hug him properly, noticing his parents standing nearby with grateful expressions. "We all need to look out for each other, Thomas. That's what people do. Remember that." When Mary finally found a quiet moment to call her sister Jessica, the emotions she'd been holding back broke through. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted the ordeal. "I did the right thing, even when it was hard," she said between sobs. "Even when people thought I was crazy. I couldn't have lived with myself if something had happened and I'd stayed quiet." "I'm so proud of you," Jessica replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "Emma kept asking when you'd call. She's been telling everyone that her Auntie Mary is the bravest person in the world." Later that afternoon, as Mary waited for her rescheduled connecting flight home, she reflected on the day's events. She had learned something profound, that speaking truth to power isn't just brave, it's absolutely necessary. Sometimes being the only voice willing to speak up is the difference between life and death. The airline had arranged for all passengers to continue their journeys on different flights. As Mary prepared to board her new aircraft, the captain, a woman named Sarah White with a warm smile and steady handshake, personally greeted her. "You're a hero, Mary," Captain White said sincerely. "What you did today took incredible courage." Mary shook her head gently. "No, I'm just someone who cared, someone who couldn't stay silent when something was wrong." As she settled into her seat on the new flight, Mary thought about the 187 lives that had almost been lost. She had saved them not through any special skill or knowledge, but simply by refusing to be quiet when her instincts told her something was wrong. The universal message of hope became crystal clear to her. One person's courage can indeed change everything. When we see something wrong, we must find the strength to speak up. Our voices matter more than we know, and our actions, even when they make us uncomfortable or unpopular, can save lives. As the plane lifted off for Birmingham, Mary smiled. To herself, she was going home to her family, but she was also carrying home a powerful truth. Sometimes standing alone is the bravest and most necessary thing we can do.